Gives me great pleasure to welcome you to Identity Futures London 2020. This year's event is inevitably a virtual one and is somewhat different to our previous summits. To ensure an engaging day for everyone, we've created a mix of sessions with plenty of discussion, with audience Q&A participation plus breaks between, as we appreciate that sitting in front of a computer screen all day is far from ideal. My name is Alan Goode, and I'm the CEO and Chief Analyst at Goode Intelligence. I shall be your host for today's event. All our sessions are being recorded and will be made available on demand shortly after the event. So no matter where you are in the world, you can listen in at any time that suits you, making this event especially convenient for our global audience. Special thanks to our sponsors, IDR&D, Thales and Daughtry, who have made today possible, along with our strategic partner organization, Women and Identity. I'll start off with some housekeeping points. Everyone, except the session moderator, speaker and panelists, must be on mute. We will answer your questions at the end of the panel session. To ask a question, please use the Q&A facility. We'll get through as many questions as we can throughout the day, but also make sure we can stay on schedule so that the events flow smoothly. We shall follow up with any unanswered questions after the event is finished. And we'll be following up after the event also with a link to the video recordings of this event. We've compiled a compelling agenda for you today to reflect the ever-increasing importance of identity in a world that has seen an acceleration of digital transformation as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The need to accurately prove our identities in both offline and online scenarios is one of the most important challenges in our time, and we will be discussing some of the key points in today's event. I shall now detail today's agenda. This morning's session is run by our partner, Women and Identity, with Diane Joyce chairing and moderating a panel discussion on designing an inclusive identity system regardless of accessibility, age, ethnicity, or gender. This session ends at 11:15, where we will then have a break until 12:20, where you can watch our lunchtime recording, A Future View with Daughtry, where I was lucky to interview Daughtry's co-founder and managing director, Blair Crawford. This session will be available on demand after 12:20 GMT, so you can listen in over lunch or at a later time that suits you. Our afternoon session starts at 2 p.m. GMT, where we'll be hosting the Passwordless Odyssey powered by biometrics. Chaired by me, our panel of experts explores the journey towards being passwordless, discussing how biometric technology drives and enables a labyrinth of possibilities. This session closes at 3 p.m. and then we have a break until 6 p.m. GMT, where I shall be joined by two great speakers from Thales in a fireside chat. We shall be exploring the possibilities for a seamless and touchless passenger process from check-in to boarding, critical things to get right in these challenging times. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Diane Joyce from Women and Identity, who will be leading a panel of experts in this morning's session. Thank you, Diane.
Thank you, Alan. Hi, and welcome to our panel today. I'm really pleased to be convening a talented panel to discuss the really important topic of designing an inclusive identity system, regardless of accessibility, age, ethnicity, or gender. This is a fundamental part of the digital identity services. In fact, all identity services. So to give you a little background on myself, I've worked in the digital identity industry for a number of years, working with both private and public sector, providing thought leadership, architecture design, solutions, and innovation in the evolution of trusted online transactions. I'm a volunteer on the executive of Women and Identity. We're a not-for-profit organisation that promotes diversity and inclusion in the digital identity industry. We want to ensure that digital identity solutions are built for everyone and are built by everyone, so everyone can use them. I have an amazing group of people here today, and the key things we are going to discuss are the challenges and opportunities in designing inclusive and accessible identity services and systems. And I use the word services and systems because it's not just about the technology, it's about the whole wrapper around identity. What some of the key approaches to the challenges are, And then finally, how do we know if we've succeeded in meeting those challenges? So to set the scene a little bit, I mean, let's talk about why inclusivity and accessibility is so important. And I want to start with a quote from the UN. Everyone has the right to be recognised as a person before the law. And that's enshrined in the UN articles and is fundamentally a right of everyone in the world, not just 60% of the world. And 2020 has really changed the world and pushed us into a more digital world where services are less face-to-face and rely on the ability for people to identify themselves and access services using technology and remotely. So, as I think many of us have been saying for a while, identity systems and services are fundamental to our society and never more so than now. So let's take a high-level look at the challenges we face in designing identity systems. Many forms of identification require the maintenance of physical artifacts in an increasingly digital world and are completely reliant on the central authorities that issue and validate them. As a result, according to the UN, 1.1 billion people worldwide don't have a way to claim ownership over their identity. Without a valid form of ID, one can't own property, one can't vote, one can't receive government services, open a bank account, or find full-time employment. But more importantly, without control over one's identity, it is easy to become invisible, to be relegated to the role of spectator, unable to participate in society, simply because one cannot prove they are who they say they are. So it would seem to me that inclusivity is a great challenge for the designers of identity systems. So what about accessibility? It's often something that's left on the sidelines, but according to the World Bank, 15% of the world's population have some sort of disability. That's 1 billion people. In the UK, government figures show disability affects 11 million citizens. That's a big chunk of the UK. And if we talk about what disabilities are, the Equality Act states that you have a disability if you have a mental or physical impairment that has a substantial, adverse, and long-term effect on your ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So take a moment to think about the identity services you have access to and how would they be accessed by those with the disabilities I've described above. So that's setting the scene. We would really like this session to be as interactive as possible and run it more like a round table. So please put your questions in the Q&A and we will endeavour to answer as many as possible. But now I'm really pleased to introduce our panellists and have our panellists introduce themselves. Over to you, Keren.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I really enjoy being in conversation with industry professionals. I'm an academic. I'm a lecturer based at the University College London in the History Department and the Institute of Advanced Studies. And I'm a historian ethnographer. I've been doing research in Kenya for well over a decade. And I came to the question of digital identity in a kind of roundabout way. When I was doing research for my first book, which was about Somali transnational networks in Kenya, and I was very interested in exploring the role that ethnic Somali Kenyan citizens played within the broader national project in Kenya. The question of identity cards kept coming up in my interviews. And a lot of the people I spoke to were complained about their difficulties, the challenges they faced accessing, obtaining Kenyan national IDs, which, as Diane mentioned, are so essential for accessing a whole range of services, not just in Kenya, but elsewhere, and faced a number of very discriminatory vetting requirements in order to obtain those IDs. So I was sparked by those interviews. I had this growing interest in identification. And then at the same time, I also noticed in the decade plus that I was going to Kenya, the growing proliferation of biometric technologies in Kenya. Fingerprinting has a very old history in Kenya, dating back to the early 20th century, but it also, as a new technology, had become increasingly prevalent in the humanitarian aid sector. We see now biometric voting registration in Kenya, and most recently, Kenya has been rolling out a rather controversial digital identity program, somewhat modeled on the Aadhaar system in India. And so I, in recent years, have been exploring both the historical roots and contemporary ramifications of digital identity and biometrics in Kenya, looking at things like the UNHCR biometric program, as well as this new Huduma number program that's being rolled out in Kenya. And I'm particularly interested in the ways in which new digital identity systems affect people at the physical and metaphorical margins of the nation's border communities, migrants, ethnic minorities, people who have historically struggled to access identity cards. And I've been studying the ways in which these new technologies do or do not enable their greater inclusion within these systems.
That's great. Thanks, Keren. Lisa, would you like to introduce yourself?
I should remember to take myself off mute. Hi, my name is Lisa Lyon, and I am the founder of a ID pensions app specifically designed for the pensions for the pensions market, inclusive of all ages, cultures, and widely accessible from the design through to the deployment. I think that's all I'll say on my background, and I'll let the rest come out as we go along.
Fabulous, thank you. Shiva, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Is it Dia or Shiv? Sorry,
Yes, no, you're good. We can hear you.
Fine. Hello, everyone. I'm Shiva Gadwal, and thank you very much for having me here. I'm actually the founder of a platform, Decentralized Identity Management platform, MyEarth.Id, where we are looking at solving the trust issues between the identity issues, owners, and the verifiers. And our vision is to provide a self-sovereign identity to all human beings. I'm also leading GBA in UK and Europe, which is a global non-profit organization, which helps government and public sector organizations to solve their challenges using blockchain technology. But coming back to identity as a topic, right? So as per a World Bank report, there are over 1 billion people who don't have any form of identity. But the bigger challenge is there are over 3 billion people who don't have any digital presence. So this is a massive challenge as well as a huge opportunity in terms of what we can do with a digital identity. I think the second aspect is that while working with the global enterprise, what I've realized is that identity management is a massive problem with respect to cost of identity thefts, frauds, having both financial and reputational implications. Additionally, the risk and cost of non-compliance with data protection guidelines could run into billions. So in reality, identity is a $1 trillion problem. And I think what we have to understand is that digital identity platform needs to be inclusive in terms of being able to offer identity to everyone, irrespective of their economic, political, and social status. Also, they have to be accessible from two perspectives. So as an identity owner, how I can share my information in a privacy-oriented way and for the intended purpose. Also, as a requester of the information, the industries, they need to ensure whether the authenticity and the validity of the information is there before the exchange of value can happen, right? So this is where the problem with respect to identity is threefold, because obviously there are three parties involved in this. One is the issuer of the identity, the second is the owner of the identity, and third is the verifier of the identity, right? So in that sense, we have to look at it from all these perspectives, and which we can discuss as we move forward. Thank you.
That's great, thanks, Shiv. Dia, could you please introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Banerji, and I am the ambassador for Scotland for Women in Identity, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here I wear a couple of hats, but for today's conversation, of course, being the ambassador for women and identity is very, very important and relevant. And apart from that, I'm also the advisor to the Block Pass Identity Lab at Edinburgh Napier University, where I see very interesting identity research being done, and I advise them on how to commercialize them. So identity as a topic is very, very close to my heart. I'm also an entrepreneur and I have an identity startup. But what is most exciting about today's discussion is as we move towards a digital economy, having a digital identity is a prerequisite to social, financial, every kind of inclusion, right? And if there was ever a time to be involved in this space, I would say the time is now, because as we transform into this digital era, the way we access these identities, the way we build them, who are we building it for? These are very, very pertinent questions. And I think one of the reasons why we are here today is to discuss why inclusivity is important, why accessibility is important. And the way I look at it is, when I say it's an exciting time in terms of the technology side of it, because every day as we speak, there are new identity standards being incubated. The Decentralized Identifiers by W3C has been recently incubated. So there are fantastic, there is a fantastic ecosystem of decentralized technology, which can actually take us to where we want to be. But whilst we go through that journey, it's important to actually address the fundamentals, address the needs of the people who we are designing it for. And I'm very excited to be part of this panel and looking forward to questions from the audience and questions that Diane would have for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, I mean, what a great diversity we have just in our panel here and where they come from. But everyone seems to be in agreement that this is really quite fundamental. But just to step back a little bit, Shiv, in my opening, I gave some statistics about inclusivity and accessibility. But what's the difference between inclusivity and accessibility? Aren't they really just the same thing? What do you think?
So I think these are, the two most important aspects of a digital identity, right? And then when we talk about inclusivity, it's about who all are able to basically get a digital identity, right? Because as of today, when we look at the status from the UNICEF, right, where we are talking about 1 billion people not having any form of identity and over 3 billion people not having any digital identity in that sense. So the question is, why don't they have that identity, right? And when we look at the data, it's primarily that a lot of people who are living in third world countries or underdeveloped countries, they are lacking this digital identity. And then also there are certain communities, certain people who are refugees, who are being who are not part of any country, or people who are not part of any system. So they are being they don't have access to a digital identity, which basically leads on to many other problems as we discussed earlier, right? Mm-hmm. But then inclusivity is about how do you ensure that every individual basically gets a digital identity irrespective of their economic, political, social, health, or so many other types of statuses, right? So inclusivity is about that. When we talk about accessibility, see, accessibility comes from technology in terms of how can I use, once I have a digital identity, how can I use it, right? Because a digital identity has a specific purpose. It's needed to basically gain trust during the exchange of a value, right? And that is where accessibility becomes a very important aspect in terms of how do I as an owner of the identity, how do I make sure that I can share this with somebody in a privacy and a consent oriented manner so that I can get the service that I'm looking for. And from the other aspect, from the industry or the service provider aspect, the question is how I can trust this information which this individual is providing. So this is the question of accessibility. And I think inclusivity is a question which only technology cannot answer. It's more of a governance issue. It's more with respect to how the governments and public organizations and so many other communities come together and then make it happen. Accessibility is something where we can bring technology to the table and look at the different mechanisms. with respect to how this digital identity can be issued and how this digital identity can be then used across the world.
I think that's great. So I think they're clear definitions that we can then refer to as we go through the session today. So a question for you, Lisa. When we're considering the design of identity systems and services, what methods do you use to ensure accessibility and inclusivity? And what is the single most important mechanism to bring out inclusion?
Right, I'll try and remember all of those. I think that the most important thing is to consider your target audience, or who is going to be using your application at the design stage. And so the methods that we use, for example, so we had some focus groups of really diverse ages and abilities to test our product. We then used all of that feedback to design a prototype, and then we went out to market again and tested it on a much wider and more higher numbers to gain the feedback again. Because we're in the pensions market, the sector had many challenges, and actually you were talking about accessibility. Sometimes accessibility or disability is invisible. For example, people that are dyslexic is a really good example of okay, you're developing a product, but have you considered somebody that is dyslexic, or have you considered somebody that can't read? Have you considered somebody that has poor eyesight, or have you considered that your the information within your app has too much jargon? What you consider as a normal speech to somebody else is jargon. Actually, they don't understand the message you're trying to get across. And so before you actually go and develop anything, I think it's really important to test and measure at that design stage so that you can get it right, or get it close to being right when you do your final design.
That's great. Dia, you also work in a lab and have a startup. Lisa's made some really interesting points. Do you have anything to add as to what, when considering design of identity services, what methods do you use? Do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, absolutely. No, that was very well answered, Lisa. Absolutely. I think in terms of when we're designing it, the design aspect has to be citizen focused. Because it's absolutely pivotal. You cannot design an identity system with the organization in focus. And a lot of organizations make that mistake. They look at their products and services, and it's a focus on the organization, not so much the citizen. So the best design, the best applications which are out there are citizen focused, and I think that's absolutely key when you're doing that. And the way to do that, if you look at, if we dial back and really define identity, and identity is nothing but a mix of attributes which basically say that I am Dia, right? It is, it's everything. It's right from my birth date to my preferences, to where I live, to the language I speak. So there's so many attributes which in combination make my identity. And before we had the digital era, we had a little drawer where we kept our passport or driving license, important birth certificates. So how do you translate that? So that was always citizen focused. It was always my identity. And when I wanted to access a system, I went and presented that identity. And then the system found a way to verify that. So when I think about the technological design aspect, I cannot stress how much I value open source. We have, we need to move away from the world where we are creating organizations which are so siloed because they're interoperable. The biggest problem is you have a fantastic identity system, but it only works for that organization. That organization turns off the switch or decides to sort of liquidate, your identity sort of ends there. But it could be a fabulous system, and no one is gaining from that because it is so siloed. So I would say, in terms of technology design, the best projects out there, they're open source. They welcome other applications to be developed on it. And I'm a big believer on how to use decentralized technology to be able to come up with digital identity solutions, because essentially it's a public good. And that's the most important thing that we need to understand as organizations, as businesses. If we do not have people accessing our products and services, we will not be successful, correct? So it makes not just a moral sense, it makes practical sense that has to be open source, that has to be a public good that we are designing, and we should all contribute to it.
Great. And that actually leads quite nicely into a question we have from Lee, one of our audience. And Keren, I'll ask you this question. Who are we designing identity for? He asks, is it for citizens to be recognised? Is it for data brokers to have better data? Or for the tech companies to get bigger? What do you think?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think this just builds upon a little bit of what Dia was saying. But I would say my experience studying the Huduma number system in Kenya, which again is a new centralized biometric program and a new smart ID that ostensibly is going to replace the existing Kenyan ID. But my experience has been that if you don't include citizens and have citizens in mind, as Dia was suggesting, that the project, that kind of a project is sort of destined to fail. Right now, there is really a lack of public, for the very start, I think, of the rollout of the Huduma number system, there was a lack of public input, a lack of public participation, and as a result, a lack of public buy-in. I think a large majority of Kenyans still don't understand the purpose of the Huduma number system. Many chose to register because they felt pressured and coerced to do, not because they were convinced of its benefits. And I think that the interest on the part of digital identity systems, I think, is really varied. They serve a whole range of different purposes, so it's hard to generalize them. I think it's more useful to talk about specific cases. But I would say if you don't have citizens and users in mind from the very start, you're kind of setting yourself up to fail. Yeah.
Lisa, what's your opinion on that as well? Who are we designing these systems for?
I completely agree with Keren. It's got to be with the citizen in mind, and also what the purpose is as well. I'll pick up a point on Dia when she was talking about her passport in the filing cabinet, etc. As a person, you feel safe. You know that you know where it is. You know it's under your control. I think what's really, really important is that the end user still feels in control. So they still feel that they are in control of their identity, and that it's not been built for other purposes, and that their control is, they can withdraw, they can give, and they can share what data they want to, not necessarily all data, but maybe they need to prove that they're over 18. You wouldn't need to provide your date of birth, you just need to confirm that you're over 18. So I think that that's really, really important, considering the citizen and the end user.
And I think that's a challenge everyone's facing with. I mean, who's building these systems? What are they doing with the data, the trust? Also, the citizens or the users understanding what these systems are about, where everything goes. And a majority, I think, of the users don't really mind because they get what they want out of it and don't really delve into it much more. But I think the use of data is a really important one. And this kind of leads into the next question, which I'm going to give to Shiv first. And we could talk about this all day. So, and then, Dear, I think I'll get you to answer this as well. And it's from Dan. And it's Regarding digital identity, banks, governments, and even fintechs seem to be collaborating much more using federated and centralized identity frameworks versus SSI blockchain use cases. Is this just legacy thinking combined with traditional hierarchical systems? And how do we change that? Do we need to change that?
I think
okay, I'll sit back at this point because I know there's a big answer coming.
Yeah. No, I think it's a very, very important aspect, right? In terms of the types of identity systems that we are building, right? And then obviously there are so many different flavors. And I think there's a history with respect to how the identities have been issued and have been managed, right? So we started with paper, and then we tried to digitize that paper, and then try to store that information in a central repository. And then, but then it became specific to a purpose and owned by a specific organization. So eventually there were certain problems, and hence we moved to federated. And then multiple organizations were able to collaborate using a single digital identity, which was provided by a certain organization to a certain individual, right? But then multiple organizations were able to collaborate and use this federated system. But then it still has its own challenges with respect to how the information is being handled and how the information is being stored and exchanged, right? And I think this is where I think we need to take a step back, because when we look at the identity as a concept, right, it has a specific purpose. It's about how do you establish trust into any conversation, right, or any exchange of value. I'm repeating myself here, but it's a very, very important aspect. And that is where, when we look at identity as a concept, there are three key stakeholders here, right? One is who is issuing this identity, right? So a lot of times governments are issuing identities to their citizens. There are a lot of times different organizations are issuing these identities to their users, to their employees. And then there are certain scenarios where we have identities with respect to social media platforms, which is again owned by a certain organization. But somebody is issuing these identities for a specific intended purpose. And then we have the owner of the identity, which is going to use this identity for specific purposes, right? And primarily we are talking about government issued identities here, because we're talking about passports, driving license, because that is how we gain access to all other services, right? It could be banking, it could be finance, it could be education, it could be employment, right? So this is where let's focus on the government issued identities, right? So as I am the owner of this piece of information, how do I ensure that I am able to share this information with somebody for a specific purpose? Now, third key stakeholder is basically the industry or the verifier, because obviously if I have an identity, and if I'm not able to basically share it with somebody for gaining access to services, then there is no use of it, right? And this is where industry and the verifiers, they play a very important role, right? Obviously, we say that the identity management services, the identity platforms should be focused on citizens or the users, but we also need to ensure that the requester of this information, or the verifier of this information, or the industries who are going to provide services to this individual can actually access this information and verify this information, right? So in that sense, these are three important aspects. Now, when we look at the existing systems, so they are very, very centralized, right? For example, the government, they have a database where they store all the information. And then if that goes down, obviously all these services are blocked. And I want to basically take this example of Aadhaar here, which is India's digital identity, and which is world's largest identity program that has ever been executed, right? Because they issued identity to more than 1 billion citizens of India. And it has a specific purpose, because if you look at India, most of the citizens or most of the population lives under poverty, right? And we have understood this aspect that a digital identity is very, very important for driving social and financial inclusion. And that was the purpose that the government of India had. So what they did was they issued a digital identity to all the citizens. Primarily, the focus was the people who are living in poverty. And then on the basis of this digital identity, they were able to issue bank accounts to people. They were able to issue insurance, basic insurance to people. And using this digital identity, a multiple digital identity in terms of the insurance, the bank account, and everything, these people who are living in poverty, they were able to now get access to credit. and then they were able to basically get smaller loans and go about their lives, right? So this is where the purpose is very, very important, but then obviously it's about execution, because once you have issued that identity, now if you look at how Aadhaar is working, it's a paper-based identity, right? And it's kind of backed by biometrics, but then again it has its challenges with respect to how do I take my Aadhaar, how do I when it started, it was paper-based. I'm correcting myself here, but now it has become a proper digital identity, because now I can take it to any type of service provider in India, and then I can get any type of services that the banking.
But it's still a centralized. It's still a centralized system. So, and listening to what you're saying, are we saying that the government starts with centralized because they tend to have these documents, and the evolution is that we will harvest information from these centralized systems and federated systems and be able to use them in blockchain and SSI use cases. So, Dia, what do you think about that? Again, this is close to your heart as well. The blockchain.
Is very much. It is. It's a great question. Yeah. So there is this constant, conversation between centralized versus decentralized. And the way I look at it is, if you just take a step back from the technology aspect, it's a function of culture. Okay, so centralized is about control. Centralized is about profiting from it, and centralized also brings about efficiency. So those are the reasons why up until now, most systems were centralized, because the function was, if I'm going to create something, I'm going to create it if I'm spending money on it, it has to just benefit me. Now, what we've seen is that is, if you touched upon the financial services world, banks and large insurance companies and fintechs. If you look at the transition from there, the transition often comes from the fact that there is, of course, a change in sentiment in the world, from the fact that we want to move to a more decentralized economy, but more so it is a cost question. So today, if you look at most banks, and I worked for a few myself in my past life, we would spend close to a few $1 billion on just doing KYC. Okay. Now, if you look at that, just a simple thing, I open an account with, say, UBS. They take a few weeks to sort of verify me. Then again, I open an account with Credit Suisse. They will take a few weeks to verify me. Now, all these verification processes, they do it in it's their own cost center. They're spending billions doing that. What if they could do it together? And today it's become to the stage where you have literally one person matching, one front office member matching one back office member in banks. It's becoming unprofitable. So they are forced to change because their bottom line is being affected, and because that is where they see growth. So to me, when it comes to financial services, they too, any large financial organization today has a meaningful blockchain decentralized project going on. Okay, so the key driver is, of course, they want to be more cost effective. B, they want to actually have more people into the system, because at the end of the day, business is nothing but volumes. The more people you attract onto your system, the more people who can access your system, you have more chances of disbursing that. So I would say, in terms of culture, governments, organizations need to move away from a siloed, controlled mechanism to actually giving back control to citizens and saying, this is your identity, I didn't create it, you were born on a certain day, you have a certain attribute, and you decide to use our services and our products, and you come and tell us how you want to be identified. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Okay, thank you. Keren, that's quite interesting, because you have been working mainly in the developing world, and taking what both Dia and Shiv have said, how do you feel that centralized versus decentralized, is it an evolution? How do we move forward from this?
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I have seen, just in my experience researching both the centralized Seduma number system, but also the UNHCR's collection of biometric data in a very centralized manner, a number of concerns being raised by civil society groups, privacy advocates around this issue. This was a big issue that came up in the court case in Kenya that challenged the constitutionality of Huduma number. I do have to say, I think the UNHCR's centralization of biometric data is very concerning to me. And I've seen one of the things that I'm researching in Kenya are people who are citizens of Kenya, but can't access Kenyan national IDs because their biometrics are in the Kenyan refugee database. And I think concerns about centralization and growing interoperability, even though I understand the reasons why governments move in this direction, I think that they have all sorts of ramifications and concerns, especially for people who are at the margins of society. So I think it is a very big issue. I also would love to hear more from the panelists about SSI solutions and their potential applicability to a space like Kenya, because I want to hear more about kind of tangible use cases where a more decentralized, especially self-sovereign identity system might be applicable in a country like Kenya, especially also in a setting where maybe smartphone usage is not universal.
Okay. We've got a really interesting question that, Lisa, I'm going to put to you as an entrepreneur who's started up. And it's from Keren. And it says, we, the FinTrust project at NCL University, are currently working on a prototype for ID verification. And as Keren said, working with several different companies, working with those who have no voice in this domain, where can we share, collaborate with our findings and what we're talking about to develop a state-of-art tool? How can we start to collaborate more together, in effect?
That's a really good question. There are several places where, for example, when we were at the very beginning of our journey, we collaborated with several banks. We looked at how they designed their system, but these were organised by identity providers. So they, all of their clients came together and they shared their experiences, they shared their lessons learnt, they shared what worked, what didn't work. I personally, I don't know of a centralised where we can all share our experiences. Yeah, I mean, maybe Dia is probably a better person to answer that question, working with the university, as to how we could do that.
I'm happy to take that on. Yes, there are many communities which are actually there's a fantastic ecosystem where one can share. If you have an interesting application on self-sovereign identity, I think Sovereign, as an SOVRIN, are a great ecosystem. They are so they're an offshoot of Hyperledger, and they do some very, very interesting work. It's a foundation. Again, it's all open source. There are some great identity projects. There is Cardano has a very good identity project. Again, they're open source, and they're looking for collaborators. They just recently launched something called Atala, which is their identity platform. I think Algorand, a very, very interesting company, they have their own identity platform. So I think most large blockchains, because when you think about, and they're all trying to tackle the same issues, which is interoperability. How do you welcome more people to sort of build upon their infrastructure? Because these systems, decentralization works when you have multiple people who are part of the ecosystem. So if I set up something with just Diane, it's just the two of us, right? It could be the most amazing setup, and I'm pretty sure it will be, but
of course,
absolutely, until unless all of us participate. So the key thing to decentralization is it's up to each and every one of us to participate. And there are some fantastic projects out there which welcome this participation. So you as a university, who has an idea, who's working on an identity platform, I would encourage you to speak to all these providers and see what is your best fit with them. And they all are very collaborative. So I would encourage you to do that.
Great. Dia, you keep mentioning open source. And what about and this is a question from Shelley, what about the important role of international standards, such as the W3C, Verifiable Credential Standards, the ISO, and even the new ICAO, Digital Travel Credential? Are they important? How do we bring those into our ecosystem?
Oh, absolutely. I think they are incredibly important, and most working groups within that space actually work very, very very closely together. So you mentioned W3C. So there is something which is quite interesting in the identity space, which is called Decentralized Identifiers, or it's called the DID protocol. And what essentially it does is it creates a verified channel of communication. Now let's think about what would be the application for that. So if I am trying to access a government service, right, through a digital platform, what is the key risk? The key risk is the government doesn't know if I am actually Dia, right? And I don't know if I'm accessing the service I'm accessing is actually the government. In fact, there was an embassy in I forget where, somewhere in Africa. They were the U.S. embassy for 10 years, and it wasn't the U.S. embassy in that particular country. It'll come back to me which country it was. So you have situations like this. In China, there was an Apple store. People were working in that store but did not know that that wasn't the real Apple store. So you see, trust is a two-way system, and the key thing about accessing products and services, especially when you're accessing government products and services, you have to be absolutely certain you're divulging all this personal identification. You have to be 100% certain that this is actually the government or the public service that you are accessing. So what Decentralized Identifiers has done, and it is a W3C incubated identity standard, is it's actually come up with a way where I, as Dia, can access a government service, and the government knows that I am me, and there's a separate channel of communication between the two of us, right?
So it's important.
Verified. It is totally important. Yes,
it's totally important.
Yeah.
Shiv, I have a question here from Nishant. Now, it's quite a long question, so he states there were 5 other types of government-approved identities that are already available in India: ration cards, state ID cards, etc. Aadhaar, however, was seeded through multiple government programs as a replacement without any data protection regulations in place. This depoliticizes the nature of identity and delegitimizes prior forms of identity that people held dear. Don't you think that by placing a primary on technology, we are creating another institution as an identity purveyor that creates binary identities and further marginalize the already poor and those that are marginalized? A long question.
No, I think it's a very good question, and I think this question has been raised multiple times with respect to Aadhaar as a national ID program, and I think this is true for a lot of other national ID programs that are there, right? I think the purpose of a national ID program is to kind of offer an identity to their citizens so that they can access citizen services provided by the government, right? Obviously, there are a lot of other identities that are already there with respect to passports, driving licenses, PAN cards, and so many other identities which were listed right in the question. See, every identity has a specific intended purpose, and I think we have to be clear with respect to what an identity that you already have. What's the purpose of that? For example, a passport, it's used for traveling, right? Driving license for driving. So similarly, Aadhaar, the purpose of Aadhaar, and obviously I think we are talking it from both positive and negative perspectives. So from the positive point of view, optimistic point of view, the purpose of Aadhaar was to basically drive social and financial inclusion, because once Aadhaar was issued to people who were living under poverty, they were able to gain access to a lot of services, and they were able to gain access to credit. And based on that access to credit, they will be able to basically go about their lives, educate their children. So in that sense, it had a positive influence on the Indian society. But obviously, the question with respect to the privacy, I think that question is always there. That question is always applicable to any identity that we already have, because it's centralized identity. Passport is a centralized identity. Aadhaar is centralized. So that question is applicable to Aadhaar and so many other identities as well. And I think to address that question, we are discussing self-sovereign identity here, because that is the only mechanism through which you can first decentralize. Second, you can empower the user or the individual with the ownership of data, privacy, and consent. And then also you solve the problem of trust between three parties, right? The issuer, the verifier, and the user itself. And as Dia has explained very well in terms of how SSI can be implemented, how SSI can be used. And I think what I can tell is when Aadhaar was implemented more than 10 years ago, we were not talking about this technology, right? And I think that was a missed opportunity. But what I already know is that different ID programs, they are actually internally kind of looking at SSI. I know that even UK government, even Australia government, and even India, they are looking at basically how they can use SSI for improving these identities. But the biggest challenge is that this is a relatively new technology. And the question is that we as the experts and the industries, it's our responsibility to first prove this technology so that then it can be applied or used at a mass scale. Diane, you are on mute.
Sorry, thank you. We have so many questions from the audience, so I'm going to start to ask more of them. And they are diverging somewhat from the accessibility more into the inclusivity. This one's open to whoever in the panel would like to answer it, because I think it's a really great question. It's from Jean. I want your opinion to a throwaway, disposable identity, you know, something exactly like a one-time e-credit card number where you define a safe security tunnel in which your standard government vetted credentials grant you access to, imagining that this tunnel will only last for a while, i.e. 15 hours on a transatlantic flight, and then you are as secure as the barcode reader that reads your sequence number. What do people think about creating disposable identities? And to me, it comes into the realm of privacy. Who would like to answer that? Dia, you're nodding.
Happy to answer that. Yes, there is work currently being done on similar lines and technologies. So there is a lot of privileged data that we can access at certain times. So for instance, to give you, say for instance, you can only open a particular document when you are in a certain location, for instance, right? And that becomes very key when we work remotely. So so it could be that you have to go and sign something, but you can only do it at a certain location. So there are technologies which are being developed, which uses your GPS location, which actually has an expiration on the time, which also is also single use. So once you've viewed that, very, very much like a James Bondy kind of a situation where you see a message and then it goes in front of you, right? It's gone. One time see.
Disposable, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are technologies which support that. And there's plenty of interesting work being done around it. So yes, absolutely, there could be an era when we actually have multiple of those. You could actually come up with a certain identity or an access mechanism to a certain product services, whether it's a flight, whether it's a certain office that you need to go to, a certain document which you can only read for a certain amount of time. So those technologies exist, and I think they're very, very promising. What they do need is they need to be, every technology is as good as much you use it for in terms of adoptability. So the more organizations which actually think about more privacy, they think about how they manage privacy preserving mechanisms, they will start, I would say, embodying these sort of technologies to use them.
Great.
Can I add my 2 cents here?
Sure.
Actually, See, actually, one of the intended purpose of SSI is actually this, because you should be able to basically create a very thin layer of your identity for a very specific intended purpose, and that is where basically the content and the consent come, the privacy and the control comes in. So even this is the exact technology that we are trying out, Earth.Id, where you are able to basically create a very small iota of your identity, which is only basically which is shared only for a specific duration of time, and it has a very, very specific purpose. And actually this is powered by SSI, or verifiable credentials, because you have so many different attributes about yourself, but you can create a very thin layer, and then you can basically time bound it, and you can basically bound it by a specific purpose as well. So this is a very, very good use case.
Yes, it is. But just taking this a step further, we've been talking about SSI as a solution, but is SSI not just a lot of centralized pots where I have my SSI for this organization, for this organization, for this organization? When does our industry get to the point where I start to share across wallets instead of having to go maybe to your organization or your organization or your organization? Because again, are we not just creating the same thing again? And Lisa, you have an organization where you look after IDs, so you have IDs. Keren, I'm not sure exactly where your IDs are sitting, but are they accessible to everyone? If I wanted to use it to open my bank account, could I access it? And I think this drives me a little into the question that Andrew is asking, is how do we resolve the dynamic tension that exists between the desire for privacy and confidentiality without needing to share the details with whoever will deliver the identities we want to use? And I think this is quite a fundamental question, because all these decentralized identities are actually just spreading my identity, or are they? Keren, from your experience, what do you think?
Well, I don't think I can really speak to self-sovereign identity, as it's not, you know, I'm not an expert on that. And again, I still want to see more evidence that something like SSI could work in a space where, for example, cell phones are not necessarily ubiquitous, and where I do worry that sometimes the model of a user for SSI is a particular kind of user. And I worry about the widespread applicability, but I would defer to the panelists on that question. But I absolutely, I mean, more broadly, I mean, I think that the question of privacy is a really important one. And I worry that many of the systems that are being rolled out for some of the most vulnerable people, for example, for refugees, are ones that don't necessarily have questions of privacy in mind.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we've delved probably long enough into the decentralized at this point. So, Lisa, I have a question for you. When you're considering the design of the services, what methods do you use to test the accessibility and inclusivity? How do you actually test that, and ongoing?
Okay, so I guess it kind of crosses over a little bit on the previous question that I asked, because the tools that we use are at that initial stage of the design, not after. So when we designed our application, we tested the prototype with, of course, because we're in the pension sector, we had quite a diverse accessibility and also inclusivity that we had to address. So we did that on a small basis, and then on a larger basis, and then actually I think that we're quite unique in the industry, is that we actually have an online chat facility that allows users to feedback, and also they have that support. And we actually support people, would you believe, from how to open an iPad and how to use an iPad right the way through. And I think that that's so key, so that you can capture absolutely everything into your the design of your application, but also ongoing as well, because as we've just discussed, as technology changes, it changes from yesterday, doesn't it? And then how to be able to apply those changes, still considering how the individual feels safe, feels in control. And I think that just flipping back to open banking very quickly, that's a massive challenge, because people don't have that trust. They don't have that trust with these organisations that they're going to keep their data safe. I mean, how many data breaches have there been? And then who are they going to share it with? And so making the individual in control and safe at all times is an ongoing challenge. And that constant feedback and having that channel open, I think, is really, really important.
So the metrics you're using is from user testing. Are there any other metrics that you use to find out whether you're actually meeting the goals that you've set for your inclusivity?
Yeah, so there are there's the standard tests that you go through. I guess I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, because I always feel that that's a bit of a tick box exercise, whereas my desire is actually to provide something that really does fit the need and really is inclusive. And I strongly believe that that has got to come from the people. So you can have all of your, as we have, all of your certifications and everything else, but really how do you measure that? How do you test that? That's really got to be from that user.
Okay, so just to wrap up, I'd like to ask each of the panel as succinctly as they can to say, what is the number one action the identity industry can do to design identity systems for use by everybody? What, just the number one thing in your minds, starting with you, Shiv.
So I think the intended purpose is something which I keep talking about, right? And that is the most important thing. It's about how do we define that intended purpose. And I can take a very small example. How do you basically provide a digital identity to a child who's living in a refugee camp where there's no internet, there's no phone, and then that identity can be used to avoid human trafficking, right? So I think if we can have a very specific intended purpose and solve that using digital identity, I think that is what we need to do.
Keren.
My research in Kenya has really shown me how important it is, I would say, for designers and policymakers not to treat people or countries as blank slates, because digital identity technologies are really built atop of older systems. They're built atop of older civil registration and older identification systems. And it's really important that we understand those older histories and realize that we can't just, wipe the slate clean and impose a new digital identity system without considering these pre-existing systems upon which they're layered.
Great. Lisa?
I would actually agree with Shiv, and but just expand that and say that the consideration of your end user has got to be at the design stage, not afterwards. So if you get it right, or if you try and get it right at that design stage, then you're on the right path, and then understand that that is going to change, and be open and agile in that change and that development.
Dia.
Yes, I think I agree with everything that everyone has said in terms of summary. But just to add to that, other than being citizen focused in design, I would say to drive global adoption, we need to be more collaborative. So I'd like to see digital identity being developed as a public good, I know I've used the word open source many times during today's chat. And most importantly, start using privacy preserving mechanisms. There are technologies which exist like zero knowledge proofs and homomorphic encryptions. They should be used. If you look at our centralized identity even today, the amount of information we give to someone is too much. Like Lisa rightly said, you want to tell someone you're above 18. You don't need to know my date of birth for that. So zero knowledge proofs, homomorphic encryption, and collaboration. So that's what I would say.
And I have to say, it's great. You've actually ticked all the boxes. When I was thinking, what would my answer be? I think number one for me is we need collaboration across industries and across sectors. I think we need some sort of codes of conduct and best practices to ensure that we think about inclusivity and accessibility right up in the beginning. And I think it starts before design. To me, it's part of what is the concept of what we're doing, who are our audiences, and how do we reach everyone. Then that flows into design. And I think to achieve that, we also need diversity in our teams. We really need to make sure our workforce is diverse as possible so that everyone thinks in slightly different ways and can bring that to bear in it. But really, I think a lot of it is more about collaboration and sharing of information and making sure that we have thought leadership, research and education that's shared across the board. And you know, so a couple of our questions, and there's been a couple of questions we can't answer at the moment, have been exactly about that. How do we find out more about this? This is really interesting what you're saying. Where do we go? So kind of highlights to me that that's one of our fundamentals, is sharing that information, the whole collaboration space. So just so that our audience can get to know our panelists slightly more, I have a question for them before we wrap up. I would like each of our panelists and Alan, because I can see he's just snuck in there now, to answer this question. If you were to come back to this world as an animal, what animal would you be? Dia, you're up first.
I'd be a butterfly, I think. I like the fact that you know, the whole process is so well defined in terms of evolution. I think everything that we human beings want to do is evolution. And if to a simplistic, you know, the reason I thought for butterflies was I was explaining it to my daughter in a book. She's 3, so I was explaining what it meant, the butterfly, you know, from a caterpillar to a butterfly's transition. So I would say we all want to evolve. I want to evolve more as a human being. So to me, I would say butterfly, Diane.
Fabulous, fabulous. I love it. Shiv, what are you coming back as?
I think it would sound funny, but I think I would like to be a dog, because I think dogs are like they share happiness without any intended agenda or anything, right? So yeah, I would
Love that. Keren.
I'm afraid I'm more of a cat person, so I think I'd have to choose a cat.
The cats do tend to be in charge, I have to say. They actually train humans incredibly well. Lisa.
I would be a bird, because a bird is free to fly wherever it wants to fly, feels the wind through their wings, and has the most beautiful song. Fabulous.
Ellen?
I'd be a Cardiganshire corgi, and the reason is because that's my heritage as on my mother's side being Welsh. And I also found out a very interesting fact about them recently, which my daughter shared with me. And apparently the corgi is probably one of the oldest breeds of dogs in Britain. And there is a myth that Celtic fairies used to ride them in battle. So I would be a Cardiganshire corgi with a fairy on the back going into battle.
Now, Alan, you're much more aligned to me, because I'm coming back as a unicorn. I want to be mystical, I want to be magical, and no one will really quite know whether I exist or not. But if I really had to come back as a real life animal, I'd be a warthog, because they are so funny and they just run around in circles. Just love it. So Thank you very much for sharing your insights into your animals. This has been a great conversation, and you know, we've travelled a lot of ground, and it seems to me that centralised versus decentralised is still a really big issue in our industry that we need to get to. I do see it as an evolution. I probably take Shiv's opinion that the governments have started centralised, but now we're starting to evolve that out into something else. And as we start to look at decentralised, the accessibility is vitally important. The inclusivity is vitally important. And I think from everything everyone said today, there's an evolution happening here. We are getting there. So I just want to thank the panelists for their views. I think it's fantastic. And wrap up. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Diane, and the panelists for such an excellent session this morning. Please look out for an email from us that contains the link for the lunchtime recording with Daughtry, available to watch from 12:20 this afternoon. So we look forward in welcoming you all back for our afternoon panel on the Passwordless Odyssey at 2 p.m. GMT. Thank you very much.